she was not supposed to exist. The records had been burned. The midwife had been silenced. The woman who had given birth to her had been buried in an unmarked grave before the snow even settled. And child had been wrapped in a servant's cloth and placed at the door of a woman who asked no questions and demanded no answers, because people like her never did. They called it mercy. It was not mercy. Mercy does not bury a child's name. Mercy does not scratch out an entry from a royal register with such force that the quill tears through 3 pages beneath it. Mercy does not send men on horseback 14 years later to make sure the erasure had held. But it had not held, because she was still here, still breathing, still carrying in her veins the one thing 7 powerful men had spent 2 decades trying to destroy. And tonight, on the coldest evening Wiltshire had known in 30 years, she was walking through the iron gates of Ashenveil Hall, the ancestral seat of the Duke of Merivane, with mud on her boots and a secret she did not yet know she carried. The gates of Ashenveil Hall did not welcome you. They assessed you. Isolde Vane noticed this the moment she stepped through them, how the iron scrollwork seemed to lean inward, as though the estate itself were pressing close to examine her face, her posture, the particular way she carried the tension in her shoulders. She had grown up in houses that ignored you. This one watched. She stopped walking and looked up. The hall rose from the frozen earth, like something that had decided long ago that it would not be moved. Stone the colour of old ash. Windows so tall and narrow they resembled the faces of people trying not to show emotion. A roof of black slate that collected the last of the winter light and gave nothing back. Around it, the ground stretched in every direction, geometric hedgerows gone slightly wild at the edges, a long gravel drive that crunched with authority beneath her boots, bare oaks standing in rows like soldiers who had forgotten what war they were waiting for. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She hated it immediately. "You're letting the cold in through your mouth," said the woman walking 3 steps ahead of her. Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper. She had not looked back once since the carriage had deposited them both at the end of the drive, and she did not look back now. Her spine was a straight and unforgiving thing, and she moved across the gravel as though the cold had been personally informed it was not permitted to affect her. "Close it. First impression matters at Ashenveil." Isolde closed her mouth. Then she opened it again. "I wasn't told the hall would be this large. Most things are larger than people expect when they've only heard of them second-hand. Mrs. Pell reached the front steps and turned not to look at Isolde, but to study the door with the proprietary expression of someone who had been keeping something in working order for so long they had begun to think of it as their own. "You were engaged as a maid of all work, not a guest. The door you'll use is around the east side. Follow me." Isolde followed. She had been following instructions all her life. She was 19 years old, and she had been following instructions since she was old enough to understand that instructions were what kept a girl like her fed and housed and marginally safe. She was good at it. She had learned to make herself small and efficient and agreeable, to anticipate what was needed before it was asked, to move through spaces without disturbing them. She was less good at the part where she pretended not to notice things, and she was noticing a great many things about Ashenveil Hall. The east door opened into a corridor that smelled of beeswax and stone, and something older beneath both, something Isolde could not name, but that settled at the back of her throat, like a word she almost remembered. The corridor was lit by oil lamps placed at intervals, each one throwing a warm circle of light that did not quite reach the ceiling. The ceiling was high enough that the lamplight gave up before it got there and left the upper half of the hall in a permanent, dignified shadow. The walls were covered in portraits, not unusual for a house like this. What was unusual was the feeling the portraits gave her as she passed. Not the ordinary indifference of painted faces, but something more specific. Something that prickled along the back of her neck and made her want to look at them directly while simultaneously making her want to look away. She looked. Men, mostly. Generations of them, in ruffs and wigs and high collars and military dress, each one painted with the particular expression of someone who expected the world to hold very still while they decided what to do with it. Dark eyes, sharp cheekbones, a jaw that in several of the portraits was so similar across 3 centuries, it looked less like inheritance and more like insistence. And then a woman. Isolde stopped. She was not like the others. The others had been painted full of certainty, full of themselves, full of the specific gravity of people who have never had to argue for their right to take up space. This woman was painted differently. She sat at a slight angle, as though she had been about to stand when the painter caught her, and her hands were not folded in her lap the way aristocratic women's hands were painted. They were open, palms slightly upward, as though she were in the middle of explaining something. She had dark auburn hair and grey eyes, and a quality about her that Isolde could not precisely name a quality of being present in a way most portrait subjects were not. Most of them looked out of the canvas towards some fixed middle distance. This woman looked directly at whoever was standing in front of her. She was looking directly at Isolde. "That one's not for looking at, Mrs." Pell said from further up the corridor, without turning around. Isolde pulled her gaze away. "Who is she?" A pause. Brief, but deliberate. "No one. Mrs." Pell's voice was the same, flat and smooth and giving nothing. "Come, I'll show you your room before I take you to meet Mr. Crane." Isolde came, but she stored the moment the way Mrs. Pell had paused, the way the portrait woman's painted palms had faced upward, and she filed it into the careful internal cabinet she had been building since childhood. The one labelled things that are not nothing, no matter what anyone tells you. Her room was on the top floor. Of course it was. Small, north-facing, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden and a view of the moors beyond the garden wall. A landscape so vast and grey and indifferent that looking at it made Isolde feel, paradoxically, less alone. She had always found comfort in large, empty things. They did not pretend to be interested in you. There was a bed with a good mattress, which surprised her, a washstand, a wardrobe, a small chair by the window with a faded cushion on it. On the windowsill, someone had left a dried sprig of lavender that had given up its scent years ago, but maintained the memory of it faintly, the way very old grief sometimes did. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against the coverlet and breathed. She had left the village of Cradden Marsh 3 days ago. She had left the house of Mrs. Thorne, who had kept her for 10 years, and then, when her own daughter had married a man who wanted the spare room, had given Isolde a character reference and 2 weeks' wages, and told her she had arranged a position through an agency in Salisbury. Isolde had not argued. She had packed her single bag, thanked Mrs. Thorne with genuine warmth, because the woman had not been cruel, only practical, and she had gone. She was always going. She had been going since she was old enough to understand that she had no fixed point to return to. She did not know who her mother had been. She did not know who her father had been. She had a name, Isolde Vane, and she had been told, when she asked that it was the name she had come with. As though she had arrived in the world already labelled, the way parcels arrived at the post. She had stopped asking by the time she was 12, not because she had stopped wanting to know, but because she had learned that wanting something you cannot have is a particular kind of exhaustion, and she had other things to spend her energy on. Now she was here, at Ashenveil Hall, in a room that was small but clean, with a view of nothing that somehow felt like everything, and a strange prickling awareness that she could not yet explain. She stood and went to the window. Below her, the kitchen garden was silver with frost, the bare vegetable beds geometrically exact. Beyond the wall, the moors began rolling, and dark, and absolutely quiet. The sky above them was the colour of pewter, heavy with snow that had not yet decided to fall. And then, in the garden below her, movement, a man. He walked with his back to her. Along the far edge of the kitchen garden, following the line of the stone wall, he was wearing riding clothes and no coat, despite the temperature, which struck her as either very stupid or very deliberate. His dark hair was slightly disordered from riding, she supposed, or from weather, and his hands were clasped behind his back in the attitude of someone deep in thought or deep in argument with himself. He stopped at the corner of the wall. For a long moment he was absolutely still. Then he turned not toward her. She was 3 floors up and invisible, but toward the moors. He stood looking out at them with an expression she could not read from this distance. From here she could only see the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness, which was not restful. She had met restful stillness. This was something else. This was the stillness of something contained. Mrs. Pell's knock at her door made her step back from the window. "Mr. Crane will see you in 10 minutes, the housekeeper said through the wood. "Make yourself presentable." Isolde looked down at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. Grey dress, brown hair scraped back, mud still at the hem which she would need to address, a face that was, in her private assessment, unremarkable, not ugly, not pretty, simply there, the way useful things were simply there. She pressed her hands to her cheeks and felt the cold of the window glass still on her palms. Below in the garden, the man was gone. The space where he had stood was empty, the frost unmarked, as though he had not been there at all. But she had seen him. She filed that, too, into the cabinet. And she went to make herself presentable. Mr. Crane was the kind of man who had been designed, Isolde decided, to make other people feel they had arrived slightly late to something important. He was already standing when she entered the study, already standing and already reviewing a document with the focused attention of someone, performing the act of being busy rather than simply being it. He was thin and precise, somewhere in his late 50s, with silver hair combed flat and the dry, papery quality of a man who had spent decades in service to a great house and had begun, at some cellular level, to take on its properties. He looked, in short, like Ashenveil Hall in human form. He did not look up immediately. Isolde stood in the doorway and waited. She was good at waiting. She had the particular patience of someone who had learned early that your time was the least important time in any room, and had made her peace with it not bitterly, simply as a fact of the world, the way weather was a fact. "Miss Vane," Mr. Crane said finally, setting the document down and looking at her with the assessing expression of a man conducting an appraisal. "You come with a reference from a missus, Dorothea Thorne of Cradden Marsh, who describes you as diligent, capable, and notably self-sufficient." He paused on the last phrase, as though deciding whether it was a compliment or a warning. The agency has placed you here as maid of all work, with the understanding that Ashenveil Hall operates under particular expectations of discretion. Are you a discreet person, Miss Vane? I have never had cause to be otherwise, Isolde said. Mr. Crane looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a man who had already formed his opinion. Then he nodded once. Good. You will find your duties listed in the household ledger, which Mrs. Pell will walk you through in the morning. The upper east wing is not to be entered without specific instruction. The library requires a key, which only I carry. His Grace is in residence and is not to be disturbed unless he rings for staff, which he rarely does. A pause. You will learn quickly that Ashenveil Hall prefers quiet. I would suggest you prefer it too. Of course, Isolde said. She was dismissed. She went. The household, she learned, had exactly 11 members below stairs, a number that seemed both too large and too small for a house of Ashenveil's proportions. Too large because the rooms she was assigned to kept and maintain were so unused they had the quality of preserved things. Rooms maintained not because they were needed, but because letting them fall into disrepair would be an admission of something. Too small because the hall itself was simply enormous, and 11 people could not breathe enough life into it to stop it from feeling like a held breath. She met them over the course of that first day and the morning that followed. Cook was a woman called Beryl Skett, broad and competent, with flour permanently beneath her fingernails, and a manner of speaking that assumed everyone in the room was already 3 steps behind her and had simply not admitted it yet. She handed Isolde a cup of tea on her first morning and said, without preamble, "You're not from service, are you?" "Not really." "I have been in service for 10 years, Isolde said. Beryl looked at her with the evaluating gaze of a woman who had read people the way other women read weather. "That's not what I said." She did not explain further, and Isolde did not ask, because there were potatoes to be peeled, and the morning had a rhythm she was already learning. The footman was a young man called Phineas Court Finn, he said. Almost before she had finished learning his full name, with the easy confidence of someone who had decided very early that formality was for people who weren't sure they were likable. He was 22, blonde, and in possession of a grin that appeared to be a permanent fixture. He was also, Isolde discovered, one of those rare people who could deliver information while appearing to simply be making conversation. "The East Wing," he said on her second morning, passing her in the corridor with a stack of folded linens, "is where the old Duke kept his private rooms, before the current one. You'll hear it said they were close, the two of them, the old Duke and his son. But what that actually means is that His Grace grew up in a house where things were not discussed. Runs in the family, apparently." He glanced at her sideways. "Mrs. Pell tell you it's just renovation keeping the wing closed. She won't be lying, exactly. There just also happens to be more to it." "And what's the more to it?" Isolde asked. Finn's grin did not falter, but it changed quality slightly, becoming the grin of someone who has calculated the difference between what he can say and what he will say. "That," he said cheerfully, "is above my station." And he turned the corner and was gone. She had been at Ashenveil 4 days before she properly encountered the Duke. Not the man from the garden, she had not seen him again. And when she mentioned, carefully and casually, to Finn that she had seen a man walking the kitchen garden on her arrival, Finn had gone carefully and casually blank in return and said, "Probably one of the groundsmen," in a tone that meant it was not one of the groundsmen. She encountered the Duke because she made a mistake, not a serious one, a directional one, on the morning of her 4th day, tasked with carrying a basket of cleaning materials to the upper south corridor. She took a wrong turn. The hall's corridors had a particular talent for rearranging themselves in her mental map, and found herself in a gallery she had not previously entered. She knew it was wrong immediately. Not because it was locked or guarded, but because it was different from the rest of the house, in the way a held breath is different from an exhaled one. The same stone walls, the same dark floors, the same tall windows. But here the proportions felt deliberate. The room had been designed to make you feel small in a specific, intended way, and the walls were covered in paintings, not portraits. Landscapes, mostly, though that was not quite right either. They were landscapes of places that felt internally consistent, each one as though the painter had not been recording geography, but geography's emotional equivalent, dark water. A sky at a precise moment between late afternoon and something that was not yet evening. A stand of birch trees in winter, their white trunks so precise they looked less painted than remembered. Isolde set down her basket and looked. She should not have stopped. She knew she should not have stopped. But the paintings had a quality she could not move past without acknowledging, the way very true things sometimes did. "That one is the moor in January," said a voice behind her. She did not startle. She turned. He was standing in the doorway she had come through, which meant he had come in behind her, silently, which meant either he moved very quietly or she had been more absorbed than she had realized. He was the man from the garden. She knew it before she had fully taken him in. The dark hair, still slightly disordered, the riding coat he was wearing now, because it was not winter cruel outside, but merely winter. He was taller than she had estimated from 3 floors up, and younger than a duke had any right to be, which she understood immediately, said less about him and more about what his family had lost to get him there. He had dark eyes, precise features, and the quality she had noticed from the window that specific, contained stillness. Up close, it was more legible. It was not coldness. It was the expression of someone who had trained themselves so thoroughly to give nothing away that they had forgotten what giving something away felt like. He was looking at her with an expression that was almost not quite, but almost recognition. "I apologize," Isolde said. "I took a wrong turn. I was not meant to be in here." "No," he said. And then, as though the word had not quite served its intended purpose, "You're the new girl, the maid of all work. Isolde Vane, your grace." Something shifted in his face when she said her name. So brief she would have missed it if she had been less attentive, if she had not had a lifetime's practice of reading the small movements of people who thought their faces were still. It was there, and then it was not a flicker, quick as a spark from flint, gone before it fully formed. "Vane," he said, the word deliberate, carefully neutral. "Where are you from, Miss Vane?" Cradden Marsh. "In Wiltshire." He looked at her for a moment, that was slightly longer than the question required. Then he stepped aside from the doorway. "You've taken a wrong turn. The south corridor is to the left, then left again. Do not take the right-hand passage, it leads to the east wing." "I understand. Thank you, Your Grace." She picked up her basket. She walked toward the door. He did not move, Firth Burr back, which meant she had to pass within a few feet of him, and as she did, as she was level with him, eyes forward, posture correct, she felt with absolute certainty. With the particular certainty she had learned to trust, because it had never been wrong that he had turned to look at her. Not at her back, at her face, as though trying to catch it at a different angle. As though the angle mattered, she did not turn to check. She turned left in the corridor and left again, and found the south passage exactly where he had said it would be. That evening, she sat in her small chair by the north window and looked out at the moors. She turned the interaction through her mind carefully, the way she turned everything, not anxiously, but methodically, the way a navigator checks their instruments, not from fear, but from the understanding that precision is what keeps you on course. The Duke had looked at her name like it was something he had heard before. He had looked at her face like he was trying to solve a problem. And in the gallery of paintings, the paintings that looked less like geography and more like its emotional equivalent, she had felt. Standing in that room, in that house, with its watching portraits and its closed east wing and its 11 staff, who were both too many and too few, a feeling she had no reasonable basis for. She had felt, for exactly one moment, like she had been somewhere before. Not the room, not the hall, not any place she could name, like she had been recognized. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window and looked out at the dark moors and told herself firmly that she was a maid-of-all-work in a large house, and that large houses had that effect on people they were built to impress, to overwhelm, to make you feel the weight of everything that had happened inside them before you arrived. She told herself this. She almost believed it. Below, in the kitchen garden, exactly where she had seen him on the first evening, a lamp moved through the dark, then stopped, then went still, as though whoever carried it had paused at the corner of the wall and stood looking out at the moors from below, the same way she was looking out at them from above. The lamp stayed still for a long time. She watched it until her eyes ached, and then she drew the curtain and went to bed, and told herself that whatever she was beginning to feel was simply the strangeness of a new place and the particular cruelty of loneliness in unfamiliar rooms. She had been wrong about things before. She had never been wrong about things like this. How did that story hit you? Tell me in the comments. If you enjoyed this, like, share, and subscribe. It really does make a difference. And I always love knowing, where are you watching from? It was Beryl who first said the thing that no one else in the house would say. She said it on a Tuesday, which felt important to Isolde later, the ordinariness of the day, the flour on the table, the smell of rendered fat and wood smoke, the complete absence of ceremony around a sentence that would take up permanent residence in Isolde's chest and refuse to be evicted. They were preparing the evening meal. Isolde had been tasked with stripping the rosemary from its stems, a job that required enough attention to keep the hands busy and not enough to stop the mind from wandering. And Beryl was at the range doing 3 things simultaneously with the ease of a woman who had long ago stopped thinking of cooking as individual tasks and experienced it instead as a single, continuous act. You have her. Colouring, Beryl said. Isolde looked up. I beg your pardon? Beryl did not look at her. She was adjusting the heat beneath a pot with the focused attention of someone who had decided to say a thing and was now letting the thing exist without additional assistance. The woman in the East Corridor portrait, the one Mrs. Pell told you not to look at. A pause. You have her colouring, the hair, the grey in your eyes, the way you carry yourself when you think no one's watching. The rosemary stems sat between Isolde's fingers, forgotten. I don't know who that woman is. Isolde said carefully. No, said Beryl, you wouldn't. She turned from the range and looked at Isolde directly for the first time in the conversation, with the expression of someone who had been deciding for several days whether to hand over something heavy. And it's not my place to tell you, but I'll say this, and then I'll say nothing more on it. There are things buried in this house that didn't stay buried, no matter how deep they were put. And when something that was buried starts walking around asking questions with its face, even without knowing it's asking them, the house notices. Beryl, rosemary. Beryl turned back to the range. Strip it clean. Isolde stripped it clean. but her hands were not entirely steady, and the evening light through the kitchen window seemed, for a moment, to have the quality of something remembered rather than something seen. She went back to the portrait. She went at the hour when the corridor was empty after the evening meal, before the lamps were turned down, in the particular interval when the house breathed differently, when the staff dispersed to their own rooms and the hall settled into its own enormous quiet. She carried a single candle, and she moved without sound, which she was good at, and she stood before the portrait in the east corridor, with the flame held up, and looked. She had not let herself look properly the first time. Mrs. Pell's voice had pulled her away before she had taken the woman in fully, and she had stored only impressions, the open hands, the grey eyes, the quality of presence. Now she looked. The woman was perhaps 30 in the portrait, though there was a quality about her that made age feel like a secondary concern, the way very particular people were not exactly ageless, but seemed to exist at a slight angle to the ordinary progression of time. Her hair was dark auburn, dressed simply for a portrait of this evident quality, less elaborate than the fashion of the period suggested it should be. Her dress was fine, but not ostentatious. Around her throat she wore a single piece of jewellery, not a necklace, but a small brooch, oval, set with what appeared to be a dark stone surrounded by a border of smaller ones. Isolde looked at the brooch for a long time. Then she looked at the woman's face. She had Isolde's eyes. Not similar eyes, not eyes of the same colour that might be attributed to coincidence or type. These were Isolde's eyes, the particular shape of them, the slight heaviness of the upper lid, the way the grey had a quality of depth to it rather than flatness, as though what was behind it was worth looking for. Isolde made herself breathe. She made herself be rational, because rationality was the only tool she had in this moment that was not shaking. Portraits were old. Painters were not always precise. Colouring could be coincidental. Grey eyes were not extraordinary. She was a maid-of-all-work from Cradon Marsh, and she was standing in a corridor at night, letting a painting do things to her composure that she could not afford. She turned away. She had taken 3 steps when she heard footsteps from the far end of the corridor. She did not have time to move before he turned the corner. The Duke stopped. He was carrying a candle also, and for a moment they stood in the east corridor, facing each other across 10 feet of cold stone floor, with their 2 small flames, making the dark more visible rather than less. He was in his shirt sleeves, no coat, no cravat, which meant she had caught him between one version of himself and another, the version the house saw and the version that existed in the private hours. And the unexpectedness of it made the air between them suddenly different. He looked at her. He looked at the portrait behind her. His jaw tightened slightly. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace." She held her ground, because the alternative was retreating, and she found, standing in this corridor with this portrait at her back and his eyes on her face, that she was not willing to retreat. Not yet. "I apologize for being in this corridor at this hour." Are you apologizing for the hour, or for looking at the painting? A beat. Both. He walked toward her, not aggressively, but with the directional certainty of a man who had decided to cover distance, and stopped close enough that the light from his candle reached her face. He looked at her. Then he looked at the portrait. Then he looked at her again, and the expression on his face was the one she had glimpsed in the gallery. That same brief, terrible flicker of something, but this time it did not disappear as quickly. "Who are you?" he said, and the question was not the one she had been asked on her arrival. This was not, "What is your name? Where are you from?" This was something older and more urgent, the question beneath the question, the one that had no polite form. "I don't know," Isolde said. And she meant it so completely that the honesty of it surprised even her. The clean, undefended admission of it, falling out of her without the careful wrapping she usually put around true things. "I don't know who I am. I never have." Something moved across his face that she could not name. It was not pity. She would not have tolerated pity, and she thought, with a certainty she could not explain, that he knew that. It was something else. Something that looked, in the unsteady candlelight, uncomfortably close to guilt. He stepped back. The expression sealed over. "This corridor is cold," he said. "Return to your room, Miss Vane." She returned to her room, but she lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling and listening to the hall breathe. And she thought about the way he had looked from the portrait to her face and back again, and the word guilt. And what a man would have to know to wear it like that, looking at a woman who did not know her own name. The external threat arrived, as external threats often did, without announcement and with significant luggage. His name was Lord Aldrich Fenmore, and he arrived on a grey Thursday in a black carriage with a crest on its door that Finn identified in an undertone as belonging to one of the oldest families in Dorset, older than Ashenveil, which says something, and none of it good, Finn added, with an expression that suggested he had opinions about Lord Fenmore that his position prevented him from sharing in full. Isolde watched from the upper window as Lord Fenmore descended from the carriage. He was perhaps 45, broad-shouldered, with the well-maintained look of a man who had decided that physical impressiveness was a political tool and had invested in it accordingly. He was handsome in the blunt, architectural way of men who had never needed charm to get what they wanted. He looked up at the hall as he descended, and his expression was one Isolde had seen before on the faces of people entering places they intended to eventually own. He looked at Ashenveil the way some men looked at women. Like the only question was timing. The Duke received him in the front drawing-room, Isolde knew because she was tasked with bringing the tea service, and the 20 seconds she spent in that room settling the tray told her more than an hour of overheard conversation would have. The Duke sat with the contained stillness she had come to recognize, but there was an edge to it today, a tightness across the shoulders that was not his ordinary restraint. Lord Fenmore sat across from him with his legs extended and his expression pleasantly proprietorial, the expression of a man visiting a negotiation he expected to win. His Grace is not pleased about the visit. Pin informed her in the corridor after, in the tone of someone announcing weather. Lord Fenmore has connections, is the word Mrs. Pell uses. To the family, the old Duke's time. There's a matter of some debt, or something that calls itself a debt, that Lord Fenmore has apparently been patient about for a long time. He paused significantly. Lord Fenmore is apparently done being patient. What kind of debt? Isolde asked. Finn looked at her sideways. The kind that was never about money. He walked away. Isolde stood in the corridor and thought about the kind of debts that were never about money, and about the East Wing, and about a portrait of a woman with open hands and grey eyes, and about the way the Duke had said, "Who are you?" as though the answer would cost him something. The conflict, when it arrived between them, came from the most ordinary of causes. She was carrying a bucket of water up the back staircase when she heard raised voices from the study above, not words. The walls were too thick for words. But volume and quality, the acoustic signature of two men who had been circling something for a long time and had finally stopped pretending to move toward anything other than each other. She increased her pace. She was at the top of the staircase when the study door opened and the Duke came out of it with his jaw set and his eyes doing that thing they did, where they were entirely focused and entirely closed at the same time. He saw her. He stopped. Move, he said, not unkindly, but stripped of everything except the instruction. The voice of a man whose self-containment had been under pressure all afternoon and had approximately nothing left for manners. Something in Isolde's chest, which had been patient and cooperative and admirably self-regulating for the 4 days since the corridor, chose this precise moment to stop being any of those things. "I am moving," she said. "Your Grace." And she continued up the last 2 steps and into the upper corridor with her bucket and her back straight. And the specific dignity of a woman who has decided that being dismissed curtly is the one thing she pulls. Will not absorb without acknowledgement. She heard him stop in the corridor behind her. Miss Vane. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the assessment, not the guilt, not the contained, whatever it was. This was startlement. The particular startlement of a man who has not been answered back and is momentarily unsure what to do with the experience. "I should not have spoken to you that way," he said. Each word placed like something he was measuring as he set it down. The apology was so unexpected that it cost her her composure for exactly 1 second before she recovered it. "No," she agreed. "You should not have." He stared at her. Something in his face did a thing she could not categorize. "You're nothing like what you were supposed to be," he said. And then he turned and walked down the corridor and left her standing there with the bucket and the words, "nothing like what you were supposed to be," landing in her chest with the weight of something that had been aimed very precisely. Supposed to be, not nothing like I expected. Not nothing like other servants. Supposed to be. She stood in the corridor and felt the hair rise on her arms beneath her sleeves and told herself it was the cold. It was not the cold. The library key went missing on a Friday. Not stolen, mister. Crane was emphatic on this point, his dry voice carrying an unusual edge when he addressed the staff at morning assembly, his eyes moving across each face with the assessing precision of a man running calculations. Not stolen, misplaced, which was, in Isolde's private assessment, a distinction, mister. Crane was making less for accuracy and more because stolen implied a breach of the particular order he had spent decades constructing, and that was a thing he was not yet willing to name. It was found by afternoon. On the floor of the east corridor, directly below the portrait, Mrs. Pell picked it up herself, said nothing, returned it to Mr. Crane, and the matter was declared closed with the efficiency of a house that had long practice at closing matters. But Finn found Isolde in the linen room before supper and said, very quietly, "The library key doesn't just fall, it lives on Mr. Crane's person, has done for 11 years. He looked at her with the expression he wore when he was delivering information he had decided she needed. Someone took it and put it back, and they put it back there specifically. Isolde folded a pillowcase with care. "Below the portrait." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" Finn was quiet for a moment in the way he was rarely quiet, the grin absent, something more serious occupying the space it usually held. "Because I've been in this house for 4 years, he said, "and I've never seen the Duke look at anyone the way he looked at you in that corridor on Tuesday, and I've never seen him apologize to anyone. Not once. Not for anything." He picked up a folded sheet, looked at it, set it down, and because whatever is happening in this house right now, with Lord Fenmore here and the East Wing and the portrait and you arriving when you did, I think you're the only person in it who's going to be honest about what they're seeing. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was a maid-of-all-work, and she was seeing nothing except corridors and cold rooms and a situation that was not hers. She said neither of those things because they were not true, and she and Finn had established, without discussing it, a small and careful territory of honesty between them that she was not willing to violate. "Thank you," she said instead. He nodded once. and left, and she stood in the linen room with the smell of clean cloth around her, and the key's relocation sitting in her chest like a coin dropped into deep water, still falling. The Duke found her in the kitchen garden the following morning. She was there because Beryl had sent her to cut the last of the winter herbs before the cold took them entirely, and she was crouched at the edge of the frost-stiff bed with her basket and her small knife, doing the kind of focused, quiet work that she had always found settled her mind in the way nothing else quite did. The sky was low and white, and the air had the still quality of the hour before it decided what weather to become. She heard him before she saw him, the particular weight of his footfall, which she had been cataloguing without intending to, the way you catalogued anything you encountered repeatedly in an enclosed space. He stopped a few feet away. She did not look up immediately. "You're the only person who uses this garden," he said. "The herbs need cutting," Isolde said. "No one else was doing it." A pause. "That is not a criticism." She looked up then. He was standing with his hands at his sides rather than clasped behind his back, which was different, and he looked like a man who had come somewhere with an intention and was now in the mild difficulty of having arrived without quite knowing how to begin. She waited. "I owe you a better explanation than what I gave you in the corridor," he said finally. "For what I said, supposed to be." The words landed the same way they had the first time, with weight, with precision. "You don't owe me anything, Your Grace. Nevertheless." He sat down on the low stone wall at the garden's edge, which surprised her so thoroughly she nearly dropped the knife. Dukes, in her limited experience of them, did not sit on low walls in kitchen gardens. But he sat with the naturalness of a man who had done it before, years ago perhaps, when the garden had been someone else's territory too. "My father built this house's silences," he said. He was a man who believed that what was not spoken could not cause damage. He was wrong about most things, and he was most wrong about that. He looked at the ground between his boots. "I have inherited the silences without inheriting the belief in them, which is a particular kind of difficulty." Isolde set down her knife. She sat back on her heels and looked at him carefully at the set of his jaw, the quality of his stillness, the precise, controlled way he was choosing words, in the way people chose words when the true ones were too direct and the available ones were not quite enough. "Then speak directly," she said, "if you're capable of it." He looked at her, that startlement again, brief and genuine. "There was a woman," he said. "My father's time. She was not of this house. She was brought here under circumstances that were not of her choosing. She stayed for a year. She left, or was made to leave. I have never been given an account, I entirely believe." His voice was level in the way that level voices were, sometimes. The sound of something held back rather than something absent. "She had a child here before she left." The kitchen garden was very quiet. "The child was not registered," he continued, "not formally. My father made decisions about what would and would not exist on record, and the child was one of them. There are people who believe the child survived, people who have always believed it." Isolde's heart was doing something it had no business doing. She kept her face still and her voice even, and deployed every skill she had ever developed in the art of not showing what was happening inside her. "What does this have to do with me?" He looked at her for a long moment, a long, direct, undisguised moment, the containment set entirely aside. "Your eyes," he said quietly. "Your name. The way you hold your hands when you're thinking." He stopped. "Vane." She used the name Vane. It was not her real name. It was one she used in this house when she was here. He paused. "She is the woman in the portrait." The frost on the herb beds glittered in the flat white light. I was given that name, Isolde said. Very carefully. I was told I arrived with it. I know. His voice was the quietest she had heard it. I know. She stood up. Not from agitation from the physical necessity of being upright, while she processed what her body was already telling her before her mind had fully caught up. She stood, and she looked at him sitting on the low wall, and she said, "You knew before I told you my name in the gallery. The way you looked, you already—" "I suspected," he said. "I had suspected from the moment I saw you in the garden. Your face from the window." He looked away. "I did not know what to do with it." "So you said nothing?" "I said nothing." He met her gaze. "I am telling you now." "Because of Lord Fenmore," Isolde said, not a question. The logic of it assembling itself in her mind with a cold, clean precision, the timing, Fenmore's arrival, the urgency she had felt building in the house since Thursday, the debt that was not about money. Whatever he is here for, it involves this, involves her, involves the child. He was quiet for exactly the span of a breath. "Yes." "Then tell me," she said. "All of it," he told her in pieces, in the kitchen garden, and then later walking the perimeter of the grounds while the sky finally decided on snow and released it in small, preliminary flakes. He told her the way someone told things they had been carrying alone for a long time, not fluently, not in order, but with the specific relief of a weight shifted from one set of hands to another. The teller watching the listener's face to see if they could bear it. His father had loved the woman in the portrait with the open hands. That was how it had begun, not as a story of cruelty or conspiracy, but as the simpler story of a man who had loved a woman he was not permitted to love. She had come to Ashenveil as a companion to his mother, who had been ill. She had stayed. She had been, the Duke said, with a care in his voice that was not his father's memory, but something else, someone of quality. Quality was the word he used. He said it plainly, and Isolde heard what was beneath it, not a servant, not a companion, not an arrangement, someone of quality. Someone to whom the word applied the way it applied to things that were genuinely fine, and had not arrived at fineness through effort, but through the more fundamental category of being. She had been of the Vane family, a branch of it, distant and reduced by circumstance, but real. Her name had been Isadora. She had used it only here. "Isadora," Isolde said. He glanced at her, said nothing. "And the child," she said. He stopped walking. The snow was falling more steadily now, the grounds going white around them, the moors in the distance dissolving into the low sky. "The child would have a claim," he said carefully. "If the child could be proven legitimate, if the documents could be found that my father destroyed or did not destroy." He paused. He did not destroy everything. He was a man who buried things. He was not a man who could bring himself to entirely erase them. What would the claim be to? He looked at her. The snow settled in his dark hair, and he did not seem to notice, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had seen it. The containment genuinely open, the something behind it visible. "Not to Ashenveil," he said. "My father's title came through his line cleanly, but Isadora Vane was her grandmother was daughter to the third Duke of Heir, who had no legitimate male heirs." He paused. The title lapsed. But the estate attached to it did not pass cleanly. It has been held in a kind of legal suspension for 40 years, administered by a committee that has included, for the last 20 years, Lord Aldrich Fenmore. The snow fell between them. "He's been managing it," Isolde said. "Managing it," the Duke agreed. "In the way a man manages something he expects to eventually own, because the only person who could challenge that expectation is the legitimate heir of Isadora Vane." He looked at her directly. Whom everyone has assumed was either dead or impossible to prove. The estate, the portrait, the name given to a child who arrived already labelled. The men on horseback her mind had not known to imagine, sent years later to confirm the erasure had held. "He knows I'm here," Isolde said. "He knew before I did." Something hard moved through his voice. "He has resources I do not, in certain directions. He came here because he wanted to see for himself." A pause. "And because he wanted to remind me that whatever I think I know, he has the means to make it very difficult to prove." She looked at him in the snow, and she felt something she had not felt in 19 years, of carrying herself through the world as something unmoored and unattached, and, fundamentally, without origin. She felt it the way you feel ground under your feet after a long time in water, sudden, solid, overwhelming in its ordinariness. She felt located. "I want to see the documents," she said. "Whatever your father did not destroy." The Duke looked at her for a long moment, the snow between them. The hall at their backs, with its watching windows and its buried things, and its portrait of a woman with open hands. "I know where he kept them," he said. "I have always known." And something in his voice said that knowing and doing had been, until this moment, two entirely separate things. "Then take me there," she said. He held her gaze. And for the first time since she had entered Ashenveil Hall, she watched the Duke of Merovane make a decision not from duty, not from containment, not from the long, cold inheritance of his father's silences. He made it from something else entirely. "Come," he said. The hidden room was not hidden the way secrets in grand houses were supposed to be hidden. There was no panel that swung open at the press of a particular stone, no concealed mechanism behind a painting, no floor that lifted on a hinge. The room was simply locked and unremarked, at the end of a short passage in the east wing that branched off the main corridor behind a door that looked, if you were not paying careful attention, like a section of panelled wall that happened to have a handle. The Duke had a key. Of course he had a key. He had always had a key. He had simply never used it. Isolde watched him take it from his coat pocket, a small, old thing, iron rather than brass. The kind of key that was made to last rather than to impress, and she watched his hand hold it for a moment before he put it to the lock, and she understood from the quality of that pause that she was watching a man cross a threshold he had been standing before for years, not because he had lacked the courage, but because some thresholds, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed, and he had needed to be certain that what was on the other side was worth what he would have to become in order to face it. She said nothing. She had learned that his silences were not absences. They were working. The lock turned. The door opened. The room beyond was small and cold and smelled of old paper and the particular dry quality of air that had been sealed for a long time. There was a desk, a chair, a single window shuttered from outside that let in a thin line of grey winter light along its edge. On the desk, a candle in a holder. Beside the candle, a small wooden box with a clasp. On the walls, nothing. No portraits, no paintings, no pictures of any kind. The room was stripped of everything except what it had been made to contain. The Duke took out a tinderbox and lit the candle. The light spread. Isolde stepped inside. She moved to the desk slowly, the way you moved toward things you had been looking for long enough that finding them required a particular quality of care. The wooden box was the size of a small book. Its clasp was not locked. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at him. "My father put it there," he said, "after she left. I found it when I was 17. I read enough to understand what it was, and then I closed it and I left it here because I was 17, and the man who had put it there was still alive and was not a man you challenged at 17. He paused. I came back after he died. I read more, then I closed it again. Why? Isolde asked. It was the plainest possible question, and he answered it with the plainest possible honesty, which she had come to understand was what he did when he had run out of anything else. Because knowing and acting on knowing are different things, and because what the box contains, if it means what I believe it means, does not only change your life, it changes everything. The estate, Fenmore's position, this house's history. He looked at the box. It changes what my father was. Isolde looked at him steadily. You have known what your father was. A long silence. Yes. Then the box changes nothing about him that you have not already changed in your own accounting of him. He was quiet in the specific way she had come to recognize, not blankness, but the expression of a man receiving something he had needed someone else to say. She opened the box. The documents were of several kinds. There were pages in a hand she did not recognize, close written, dense, the language formal and precise in the way legal language was precise, all subordinate clauses and whereforiases. She could read well enough to follow the structure of it. She had always been a reader, in the hungry, self-taught way of people who understood early that knowledge was the one thing that could not be taken from you as easily as everything else. She read. The candle burned. The Duke stood behind her and slightly to the side, near enough that she was conscious of him as a physical presence in a room that had very little space, but not so near that it crowded her. What the document said, in the precise and consequential language of agreements made between men who believed they were deciding the world, was this: that a woman named Isolde Vane, daughter of Edmund Vane of the Dorset Vanes, granddaughter of Lady Meredith Vane, née Cavendish Roll, had entered into a private and legal union with the 4th Duke of Merivale in the year 1812. That the union had been conducted by a minister whose name Isolde did not recognize, but whose credentials were documented in a separate paper beneath. That the union had been witnessed by 2 men whose names she also did not recognize. That Isolde Vane had, in the year 1813, given birth to a child, a daughter, named in the document Isolde. The candle flame moved in a draught from the shuttered window. Isolde read the name 3 times. The way you read something you had been carrying as an absence all your life, and had just been handed the shape of, and the shape was exactly the right size for the space it needed to fill, and this was not relief. This was not joy. This was something older and more fundamental than either the recognition of something true that had always been true, surfacing at last. He married her, she said. Yes. The Duke's voice was very quiet, privately, without announcement. His family, my grandfather, would not have sanctioned it. She was reduced gentry. It was not what the house required. A pause. He loved her enough to marry her in secret, and not enough to defend it when it mattered. He sent her away. When my grandfather applied pressure, yes. He arranged for the marriage to be not annulled. He could not bring himself to go that far. Buried. The minister was paid. The witnesses were paid. My grandfather died believing it had been handled. The Duke's voice had the quality of something that had been examined many times and had not gotten easier with examination. My father kept the documents because he could not destroy them. I believe he intended to, and found himself unable. And the child, Isolde said. He arranged for the child to be placed, with a woman in Wiltshire who asked no questions. Isolde set the documents down. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and looked at the candle flame and breathed in and out, slowly, the way you breathed when the world had just rearranged itself entirely, and you needed to give your body time to understand that the ground was still there. Then I am legitimate, the Duke said. If the documents can be verified, and I believe they can, I have believed it for years, you are the legitimate daughter of the 4th Duke of Merovane and his lawful wife. Which makes you, he stopped, which makes me the heir to the Eravane estate, Isolde said. Through my mother's line, yes. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the containment, not the guilt, not the startlement. Something exposed and careful and entirely without the performance of not feeling things. He looked, standing in his dead father's secret room with the candle between them, like a man who had been waiting for something to be true that he had not allowed himself to need. You knew, she said, when I arrived. You suspected who I was, and you said nothing because telling you meant asking you to choose, he said. Between a life that was ordinary and safe and yours, and a claim that would make you a target for every person who has an interest in the Eravane estate staying buried. He held her gaze. Fenmore is not a man who accepts correction gracefully. If you pursue this, he will pursue you. He is already pursuing me, Isolde said. He arrived before you told me anything. He has been watching me since I came through the gate. She paused. The choice was never mine to avoid. You understand that. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, as though conceding a point in an argument he had already known he would lose. Lord Fenmore found them there, not by chance. Isolde understood this the moment she heard his footsteps in the passage, the unhurried quality of them, the step of a man who had taken the time to learn the layout of a house he had always intended to enter on his own terms. The door was still open. He appeared in it and stood with his hand on the frame and looked at the two of them and at the open box and at the documents on the desk, and his face did something that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, something between them, the expression of a man whose calculation had just been confirmed. Your Grace, he said pleasantly. Miss Vane. The pleasantness of his tone was the most unpleasant thing about it. I see we have arrived at the same destination by different routes. The Duke said nothing. He had gone entirely still in the specific way that was not calm. Isolde looked at Lord Fenmore and felt something she did not expect to feel, not fear. She had been afraid of things all her life, and she recognized fear, and this was not it. What she felt was a cold, clear, organizing anger, the kind that did not shake or obscure, but sharpened everything, that took the room and the man in the doorway, and the documents on the desk, and the 19 years of not knowing, and arranged them into something she could see the shape of entirely. Lord Fenmore, she said, you have been managing the Eravane estate for 20 years. His eyes moved to her with the attention of a man recalibrating. I have, under the assumption that there was no legitimate heir, under the legal conclusion that no heir could be proven. The distinction was deliberate, precise as a blade's edge. Assumption and legal conclusion are different animals, Miss Vane. You would do well to understand that before you... Those documents are signed and witnessed, she said. The minister was licensed. The marriage was legal. I was born in wedlock to the 4th Duke of Merovane and his wife. She felt each sentence land with a weight she had not known she could throw. You are managing an estate that belongs to me. Fenmore looked at the Duke. The look between them was old and specific, carrying the weight of a dynamic Isolde had not witnessed but could read the look of a man who had held leverage for long enough that he had stopped distinguishing it from ownership. "Your Grace," he said, with the pleasantness intact, but something harder beneath it now, "I would counsel caution. Documents can be questioned. Provenances can be disputed. A young woman of uncertain origin makes claims that will require—" "She is not of uncertain origin," the Duke said. His voice was quiet, the way things were quiet immediately before they stopped being quiet. "She is of perfectly certain origin. I have known it since her arrival, and I am prepared to state it before any court you choose." Fenmore's pleasantness recalibrated again. The outer layer of it thinned. "You would be making a significant enemy. You have been a significant enemy for 20 years, the Duke said. "While presenting yourself as a creditor, I find the honest version preferable." The silence in the small cold room had weight and temperature. Then Fenmore smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had several remaining moves and had decided to let you know he knew it. "I'll leave you to your discovery," he said. "We will speak again, Your Grace, soon." His eyes moved to Isolde, and the smile remained, and she looked back at him steadily, until he turned and walked away down the passage, his unhurried footsteps receding into the east wing. The room felt larger without him in the doorway. The critical choice arrived at midnight. Finn knocked at her door, and his face when she opened it was stripped of the grin entirely, which was how she knew before he spoke that what he was about to say was serious. "Lord Fenmore is leaving in the morning," he said quietly. "He made arrangements tonight. His carriage is being prepared at first light." A pause. "He also sent a rider before dinner. We don't know to whom." Isolde looked at him. "The documents. Whatever he is going to do, he is going to do it quickly." Before Finn stopped, he looked at her, and in his face was something she had not expected from him. Not just concern, but the specific loyalty of someone who had decided, without fanfare, where they stood. "Before you can use them." She sat on the edge of her bed, in the small north room with the view of the moors, and she looked at the dried lavender on the windowsill, and she held the weight of the choice in both hands. She could let it go. This was the honest version of the option. Not take time to think or proceed carefully, but the actual choice that was available to her if she wanted it. She could let the documents stay in the locked room. She could let Fenmore send his riders and build his case and challenge the provenance she had not asked for and could not yet defend alone. She could remain Isolde Vane, maid of all work, a woman of no particular origin and no particular claim, and she could leave Ashenveil in the spring and find another position and carry herself through the world in the careful, self-sufficient way she always had, and she would be safe. She would be safe. And she would be nothing. Not nothing the way she had always been. Nothing weightless, unmoored, the nothing of not knowing. This would be a chosen nothing. A deliberate erasure that she performed on herself. The same thing that had been done to her before she was old enough to resist it, done again, but this time by her own hand. She thought about Isolde Vane with her open palms and her grey eyes, and the quality of presence the painter had managed to catch, the quality of a woman who had been erased and had refused, at some cellular level, to entirely disappear. She thought about the Duke standing in the snow telling her, "Come," and meaning something more than a direction. She thought about 19 years of following instructions and making herself small and being efficient and agreeable and carefully, precisely unremarkable. She stood up. She found him in the library. Of course, he was in the library, at midnight, with the fire low and a book open on the table that she suspected had not been read. He looked up when she came in, and she saw in his face that he had been waiting for her to come or to not come, and the difference between the two outcomes had mattered to him in a way he had not tried to hide. "I need a solicitor," she said. "Someone not connected to Fenmore. Someone who can begin the verification process before he can complicate it." She paused. "And I need to know if you will stand witness to what you know." He looked at her for a moment that had the quality of something completing itself. "I will do more than that," he said. She nodded. She felt the ground beneath her feet, solid, cold, real. The ground of knowing who she was, the ground that had been there all along, waiting for her to stop walking away from it. "Then we begin tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said, and the word was not agreement. It was arrival. The solicitor's name was Mr. Aldous Pemberton Fife, and he arrived at Ashenveil on a Monday morning in a modest carriage that made no announcement of itself, which was precisely why the Duke had chosen him. He was 71 years old, small and precise, with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who had spent 5 decades understanding that the law was not a sprint and that people who treated it as one tended to fall badly. He had white hair, extremely clean hands, and the particular quality of attention that Isolde recognized immediately, the quality of someone who listened to what was actually being said rather than to what they expected to hear. The Duke had known him since childhood. He had been, he told Isolde, the evening before Pemberton Fife's arrival, his mother's solicitor, not his father's. His mother's, specifically, retained separately and quietly by a woman who had understood, in the way women in certain houses understood things, that having her own counsel was not a luxury but a necessity. "Your mother was wise," Isolde said. "My mother was practical," the Duke said. She would not have distinguished the two. Pemberton Fife was shown into the library. The documents were placed before him. He read them for 40 minutes without speaking, without changing expression, turning each page with the same deliberate care he had presumably given to every document in 71 years of careful living. Isolde sat across the table and watched him, and was still in the way. She was still when she needed to be, not with effort, but with the particular quality of a person who has learned that fidgeting is a way of announcing your anxiety to people who have not yet decided how to use it. The Duke stood at the window. He had stood at windows a great deal in the time she had known him. She had come to understand it was not avoidance, it was the posture of a man who thought better when he had something to look at that had no demands. Pemberton Fife set the last page down. "The minister," he said, "was one Reverend Caspian Maule, licensed in the Diocese of Salisbury in 1804 and serving until his death in 1841. The registration of his ministry is a matter of public record. He aligned the papers precisely. The witnesses are deceased, both of them, but their identities are verifiable through parish records." He looked up at Isolde with the steady, undramatic gaze of a man who delivered significant information the way other people delivered the weather. "The documents appear genuine. The marriage appears legal. The birth registration, though kept private, is consistent in form with legal instruments of the period." He paused. "Miss Vane, I believe you have a claim. I believe it is a strong one. I also believe that Lord Aldrich Fenmore will spend a considerable sum attempting to make it appear otherwise." "Then we are faster than he is," Isolde said. Pemberton Fife looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite surprise, but contained elements of both. That, he said, is the correct orientation. He began collecting the documents with careful hands. I will need these in my keeping. I will also need to make certain inquiries in Salisbury and in the Dorset Registry before we can file anything formally. This will take, he paused, calculating, perhaps 10 days, if we move promptly. Move promptly, Isolde said. He looked at her again, and this time the almost smile was more definite. Yes, he said. I rather think we will. The 10 days were not quiet. Fenmore's rider, it emerged through Finn's careful ear to below-stairs intelligence, had gone to a man in London, a barrister named Southerton, who had, in Pemberton Fife's dry assessment when informed, built a career on making legitimate claims appear irregular through the strategic application of procedural complexity. He was expensive, and he was effective, and he had never, to public knowledge, failed a client of sufficient means. Finn delivered this information at breakfast on the third day, standing in the kitchen with his coat still on from an errand to the village, his face carrying the particular expression of someone who has learned something they wish they had not needed to learn. Beryl, without looking up from the range, said, "Then we move faster than Southerton. We," Finn said, with a slight emphasis that was actually a question. Beryl turned and looked at him with a gaze that could have stripped bark. "You think I have cooked in this house for 14 years and cared nothing about what went on in it?" She turned back to the range. "She is Isidora's daughter. Anyone with eyes and enough years in this house knows it." A pause. "We move faster than Southerton." Isolde looked at Beryl's back and felt something she had very little experience, feeling the specific warmth of being defended by someone who had decided, without negotiation and without being asked, that she was worth defending. She found it, to her private embarrassment, quite difficult to manage composedly. "Thank you," she said. Beryl waved a hand as though thanks were an unnecessary formality. "Eat your breakfast." It was on the 5th day that the Duke told her about his father's journal. They were walking the moors they had taken to walking in the mornings, not by explicit arrangement, but by the kind of convergence that happened between two people who were both drawn to the same place at the same time, and had eventually stopped pretending the timing was coincidence. The moors in early morning had a quality Isolde had come to depend on: the vastness of them, the indifference of them, the way they put everything at the correct scale. "He kept a journal," the Duke said, "from his 40th year until a month before his death. I have read it. He was looking at the middle distance, at the pale winter sky meeting the dark rise of the moor. He wrote about her, about Isidora. He wrote about her more than he wrote about anything else, which I suspect he did not intend when he began it, and found himself unable to stop." Isolde walked beside him and said nothing, which was her way of saying continue. "He wrote about the day you were born," the Duke said. "The specific day. He wrote," he stopped, began again. "He wrote that you had her eyes, that he had held you for approximately 2 minutes before the arrangements were made. He wrote that he had intended to feel nothing and found he could not manage it. His voice was steady in the careful way it was steady when he was managing something underneath it. He wrote that he told himself you would be safe, that it was better, that there were reasons." A pause. "He wrote those reasons a great many times. I believe he was trying to convince himself they were sufficient." "Were they?" Isolde asked. "No," the Duke said simply. "They were not." She looked at the moors, and she let the information settle, not with anger, not with grief exactly, but with something more complex than either. The man who had held her for 2 minutes, and then made arrangements, had also been unable to destroy the documents that proved she existed, had kept a journal that recorded her birth with the specific helplessness of someone who could not make themselves not care, had buried her rather than erased her, which was not innocence, but was, perhaps, the smallest possible evidence of something that had not been entirely without feeling. She did not forgive him. She was not certain forgiveness was the right instrument for something this old and this structural. But she let him be what he had been, a man of his time and his weaknesses and his choices, and she let herself be what she was, the consequence of those choices, walking on the moors in winter, knowing her own name. Caspian Aldrich Merivane, she said. It was the Duke's name. She had learned it from the household ledger and had not used it because names, she understood, were things you were given access to rather than simply things you took. Why did you stay silent for so long? After you found the documents? After you understood? He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that was working. Because acting meant accusing my father publicly of a wrong that could not be corrected quietly, he said at last. Because it meant exposing something my mother had lived her whole life without knowing. Because it meant finding a girl I had no way to find, and asking her to step into a storm I had no certainty she could survive. He paused, because I was afraid. She looked at him. He was looking back, and the exposure in it was complete, no containment, no management. Just the straightforward acknowledgement of a man who had spent years inside a silence of his own making and had finally found the specific person to whom he was willing to admit it. I understand fear, she said. I have been afraid of different things my whole life. She held his gaze. But I am not afraid now. Something in his face settled, not relaxed, settled, the way something finds its true alignment. I know, he said. I noticed. They walked back to the hall in the winter light, and something between them that had been uncertain and careful, and held at a deliberate distance became, in the absence of active resistance, simply what it was. The reconciliation with herself was harder than the reconciliation with him. She sat in her small room on the 7th evening, and she conducted an honest accounting, which was the thing she did when she needed to understand where she stood. She had come to Ashenveil as a woman with no origin, and she was leaving it, not the building, not yet, but the version of herself who had no past, as a woman with a great deal of one. And the past was not simple, and it was not clean, and it contained a mother who had died without being able to return for her, and a father who had loved her for 2 minutes and made arrangements, and a house that had known about her for 19 years and kept its mouth shut. She could be angry about all of this. She had the right to it. She chose instead to be clear. Anger she could afford later. Clarity she needed now. She was Isolde Vane Merivane, daughter of the 4th Duke and his lawful wife, legitimate heir to the Erevane estate and everything connected to it. She was 19 years old, and she had been in service all her life, and she did not know the first thing about managing an estate, and she would learn. She was in a house whose current duke had kept a secret that had cost her 19 years, and had also, when it mattered, told her the truth, and she had not yet decided precisely what to do with both of those things simultaneously. But she knew that she was not willing to do nothing. She was not willing to do nothing ever again. She stood and looked in the dark window at her own reflection, the grey eyes, the dark auburn hair she had always had, without understanding where it came from, the face that was not unremarkable and never had been, and she had simply not had the frame of reference to know it. She looked like her mother. She looked like the woman in the portrait with the open hands and the quality of presence. She looked like someone who was not going to be buried. Pemberton Fife returned on the 9th day with the verification complete. He arrived in the same modest carriage, with the same deliberate, unhurried quality, and he sat in the library and laid out the results of his inquiries with the systematic care of a man constructing an argument that would stand up to the most expensive barrister Fenmore could commission. The minister's records confirmed the marriage. The diocese had always had them, filed correctly, simply not cross-referenced with the Vane family records in any public index. The two witnesses were confirmed through parish births and deaths. The birth registration, when Pemberton Fife had located the original in a secondary Salisbury registry that the senior one fed into, was present recorded under Isadora's name, the child listed as Isolde, the father's name left blank in the original, but with a separate notation in a different hand, added later, that matched the fourth Duke's documented signature in 3 other legal instruments. He had gone back and added her name. After everything, he had gone back and added it. Isolde looked at the notation for a long time. Fenmore's man has filed a preliminary challenge, Pemberton Fife said. As expected, he will argue irregularity of registration and question the document provenance. He looked at her over his papers. He will not succeed, but he will make it difficult and he will make it public, and there will be a period during which your claim is contested and your name is in circulation in contexts that are unpleasant. I know, Isolde said. There will be people who question your character, your origins, your motives. People who have an interest in the Vane estate remaining as it is, or in the Vane family remaining uncomplicated. There will be, I know, she said again, more firmly. I have been questioned all my life by people who did not know my name. I find I mind it considerably less now that I do. Pemberton Fife looked at her with the definite smile this time, the one that was no longer almost, Miss Vane, he said, with a satisfaction that was entirely professional and also not entirely professional. I believe we are ready. She looked at the Duke. He was watching her from across the library with the expression she now had language for the one that was not coldness and not distance and not containment, but was the specific way a man looked at a person who had become, without permission and without apology, necessary to him. File it, she said to Pemberton Fife. File everything. The night before the formal filing, she walked the perimeter of Ashenveil Hall alone. Not the grounds, the hall itself, the inside of it, from the kitchen to the upper corridors to the east wing, where the door was now unlocked, and the portrait hung in its corridor with the lamplight on it. She walked through the house the way you walked through a place you were preparing to stop moving through, invisibly acknowledging it, seeing it, letting it see you. She stopped before the portrait of Isolde Vane. She looked at the open hands, the grey eyes, the quality of being present. I know who you are now, she said. Not to the painting, exactly to whatever the painting had always been standing in for, in this house, in the corridor no one was supposed to look at. And they are going to know who I am. The lamplight moved. The painted hands stayed open. The grey eyes, which were her grey eyes, looked back at her with the quality that the painter had caught and preserved across the years. Not hope exactly, but its structural equivalent. The look of someone who expected to be found. She had been found. Tomorrow, Lord Aldrich Fenmore would learn what that meant. The hearing was held in Salisbury. Not a court, precisely not yet. Pemberton Fife had been careful about this. Strategic in the way that old men who had spent 50 years understanding the difference between force and leverage were strategic. This was a preliminary proceeding before a chancery examiner, a formal review of the competing claims to the Vane estate. And it was exactly the kind of proceeding that Fenmore's barrister, the expensive and effective Mr. Southerton, had been attempting to delay, redirect, complicate, and dissolve for the past 11 days through a succession of procedural manoeuvres that Pemberton Fife had met, each one with the unruffled patience of a man who had seen every move before and had simply been waiting for someone with a strong enough case to use them on. Isolde had never been to Salisbury. She had never been further than 30 miles from Cradden Marsh in her life, which struck her, as the carriage moved through the winter countryside, as a remarkable fact about a person who was about to walk into a room and claim a title. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the passing fields and took the measure of herself. She was wearing a dress she had not owned a fortnight ago. The Duke had arranged it through Mrs. Pell with a directness that had not left room for Isolde's objection. Dark grey wool, precisely fitted, with none of the ornamentation that would have announced itself, and all of the quality that announced itself anyway. It was the dress of a woman who did not need to perform consequence because she was it. She had looked at herself in the window glass that morning and had not recognized, for a moment, the woman looking back. Then she had recognized her completely. The two things were both true. Pemberton Fife sat across from her with his document case on his knees, reviewing papers with the focused calm of a man for whom the stakes of the morning were professional rather than existential. He had, Isolde had come to understand, the particular gift of treating serious things as manageable, not by diminishing them, but by approaching them with such ordered competence that they had no choice but to submit to the order. The Duke sat beside her. He had not asked if she wanted him there. He had simply appeared at the carriage, coat, and gloves, the morning composure that was not coldness, and said, "Ready?" And she had looked at him and understood that his presence was not an offer she could accept or decline. It was a statement of where he stood, and where he stood was beside her. And he had arrived at that position through the same quiet accumulation of small, true things that had brought them both to this carriage on this road in this winter morning. She had not said, "You don't have to," because he did not have to, and had chosen to, which was the only version of it that meant anything. "Ready," she had said. They did not speak much on the journey. But at some point, without particular announcement, his hand had moved to rest beside hers on the seat between them, close enough that the warmth of it reached her, and she had turned her hand slightly, not much, just enough, and the small, cold space between their fingers had closed. They had not discussed it. Some things did not require discussion. Some things were simply the natural conclusion of everything that had been building since a kitchen garden in winter, and a portrait with open hands, and a man sitting on a low stone wall who had told her, in his particular, contained, inadequate, and entirely honest way, as much truth as he knew how to give. The examination room was wood-panelled and cold and smelled of old documents and the specific anxiety of contested things. There were chairs arranged in rows, not a public proceeding, but not entirely private either. Pemberton Fife had told her there would be witnesses, interested parties, representatives of the various institutional bodies with a stake in the Heir Vane estate's resolution. She had nodded and filed it under manageable. Fenmore was already there when they entered. He was seated on the far side of the room, with Southerton beside him, a tall, angular man, with the face of someone who had decided very early that warmth was a professional liability, and had not revisited the decision. Fenmore himself was impeccably dressed and entirely composed, and looked at Isolde as she entered with the expression she had last seen in the hidden room, the pleasantness thinned with something harder underneath it. the expression of a man who had reassessed the distance between himself and an obstacle, and found it smaller than he had previously calculated. He had not expected her to come this far. She walked to her seat and did not look away from him until she had sat down, and by then he was the one who had looked away, which she filed away precisely and without satisfaction, because satisfaction was what you felt when you had won, and she had not yet won anything. The examiner was a grey-haired man named Whitfield Cross, who managed the singular achievement of looking simultaneously bored and absolutely attentive. He called the proceeding to order with the economy of a man who had conducted many of these, and saw no reason to give this one more ceremony than it required. He summarized the competing positions, the existing administrative claim of Lord Fenmore, held under the estate's lapsed title suspension, versus the newly filed claim of Isolde Vane, purported legitimate heir through the maternal line, and he invited Pemberton Fife to present. Pemberton Fife presented. He presented for 40 minutes, and he was extraordinary. Not theatrical, he was the precise opposite of theatrical, which was, in this room on this morning, far more effective. He laid the evidence in sequence, with the care of a man placing stones across a river, each one solid, each one tested, each one positioned, so that the path across was obvious and inevitable by the time he finished. The marriage documents, the minister's records from the diocese, the witness confirmations, the birth registration with the added notation in the fourth Duke's hand, the genealogical connection through Isolde Vane to the Heir Vane title, documented through 3 separate registry sources. When he finished, the room was quiet in the specific way. Rooms were quiet when an argument had been so thoroughly made that the silence was the sound of everyone present updating their positions. Southerton presented his challenge. It was expert and expensive, and Isolde watched it with the steady attention she had given to everything in this room not strong enough. He questioned the provenance of the private documents. Pemberton Fife had anticipated this, and had 3 independent assessments of the document's age and authenticity. He questioned the regularity of the minister's record. Pemberton Fife produced the diocesan archivist's written confirmation. He questioned the notation on the birth registration. Pemberton Fife produced the signature comparisons. Each challenge met, each stone on the path holding weight. Southerton finished. Whitfield Cross made notes. The room held its collective breath in the polite, suppressed way of English rooms that had feelings about things and were not going to express them directly. And then Lord Fenmore did something Isolde had not expected. He spoke, not through Southerton, himself, directly, standing up with the deliberate physical authority of a man who had always relied on the room, understanding what his standing up meant. "I would like to address the examiner directly," he said, with the pleasantness restored to full strength, the instrument perfectly calibrated. "As a man who has administered the Heir Vane estate faithfully for 2 decades, as a man who has a rather longer perspective on this family's complications than a document review can provide," Whitfield Cross looked at him with the expression of a man who found this mildly irregular and was permitting it on a provisional basis. "This young woman," Fenmore said, with a warmth in his voice that was the most precise and deliberate insult Isolde had ever received, "has been in service. She arrived at Ashenveil Hall as a maid-of-all-work not 3 weeks ago. She has, in that time, formed an attachment to the Duke of Merivale that any reasonable observer would note as convenient." He paused, letting the insinuation settle. "I do not question the document's authenticity. I question the interpretation of events that has led us here. A private marriage, unannounced. A child, unregistered for 2 decades. A claim surfacing precisely when the estate's administrative review is due, brought by a young woman who is the warmth again. Warm as a blade, closely associated with the one party who has a direct interest in complicating the current arrangement. He sat down. The room absorbed it. Isolde felt the Duke beside her go very still. She put her hand briefly on his arm, one light touch. Stay, and she stood up. Whitfield Cross looked at her with mild surprise. Pemberton Fife looked at her with the expression of a man who had not planned for this and was calculating very quickly whether to object. She looked at Fenmore. "My mother," she said, and her voice in the panelled room was level and clear and carried without effort. The voice of a woman who had spent 19 years making herself heard in houses that were not listening and had become, in the process, very good at it, came to Ashenveil Hall as a companion and left it as a wife. She left her child behind, not because she chose to, but because she was given no choice. She spent the remainder of her life without her daughter and without the acknowledgement of a marriage that was legal and documented and witnessed, because a powerful man decided that what was inconvenient to him did not need to exist. The room was entirely still. "I did not come to Ashenveil looking for a claim," she said. "I came because an agency placed me there. I did not know who I was. I did not know who my mother was. I did not know that the portrait in the east corridor had my eyes, because nobody in that house was permitted to say so." She looked at Fenmore, and she let him see her face clearly. The face that was Isolde Vane's face. The face that the riders had been sent to confirm was gone and had not been gone, had never been gone, had been walking through the world for 19 years, waiting for someone to hand it its own name. "You have been managing what is mine for 20 years, Lord Fenmore. You have been managing it on the assumption that I was either dead or ignorant or too unimportant to find. I am none of those things." She sat down. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted them. Whitfield Cross cleared his throat. He looked at his notes. He looked at Pemberton Fife's evidence. He looked at Sotherton, who was looking at his hands with the expression of a man privately revising his invoice. He looked at Lord Fenmore, who was looking at Isolde with the pleasantness entirely gone and something underneath it that was neither anger nor defeat, but the specific expression of a man who had miscalculated the nature of what he was dealing with and knew it. "I will require 3 days to review the complete documentation," Whitfield Cross said, with the measured delivery of a man giving nothing away. "All parties are to remain available for further questioning. The proceeding is adjourned." Outside, in the cold Salisbury street, with the winter sky pressing low and grey overhead, Isolde stopped walking and stood very still. The Duke stopped beside her. Pemberton Fife had remained inside to speak with Whitfield Cross, and it was just the two of them on the pavement, with the noise of the street around them and the warmth of the examination room already fading from her coat. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he confirmed. She looked at the street, the ordinary people in it, moving through their ordinary morning with no knowledge of what had just occurred in the wood-panelled room behind them. She had been one of those people 4 weeks ago, unlocated, unnamed, moving through a world that did not know her and that she had not expected to know her, and she had made her peace with it. And the peace had been genuine, and it had also been wrong. "He will appeal," she said, "even if Whitfield Cross finds in my favour. He will find grounds, and he will appeal, and it will be months, possibly longer." "Yes," the Duke said, and my name will be in every county registry and every gossip column and every drawing room in Wiltshire before spring." Yes, she looked at him. He was looking back at her with the expression that was his most honest one, the one without management or performance, just the direct and uncomplicated fact of what he felt, which was still something she was learning to look at without glancing away from the intensity of it. "Are you afraid?" he asked, not of the proceeding. She understood what he was asking. She thought of the kitchen garden in winter, and the portrait with the open hands and the small cold space between their fingers that had closed on the carriage seat, and the way he had said, "Come in the snow," as though it were not a direction, but a declaration. She thought of being 19 years old and unmoored, and moving through houses that did not know her and would not keep her, and the extraordinary, improbable specific fact of arriving at Ashenveil Hall and being known. "I have been afraid of disappearing my whole life," she said. "I find I am not afraid of being seen." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, on the cold Salisbury pavement, with the grey sky above them, and the street going about its ordinary business all around, the Duke of Merivale, who had inherited his father's silences and spent a decade inside them, and had found in the space of 3 weeks a reason to come out of them, reached out and took her hand. Not the tentative proximity of the carriage. This was deliberate. This was the gesture of a man who had made his accounting and arrived at his answer. "Then we go back," he said. "And we wait 3 days. And whatever Whitfield Cross decides, we face what comes next. Together," Isolde said. "Not a question. Together," he said, steady as ground. She looked down at their joined hands, her hand, which had always known how to hold things, and his, which was learning, and she felt the future arrange itself in front of her like the moors on a clear morning, vast and uncertain and entirely, terribly, beautifully real. She did not know what Whitfield Cross would find in 3 days. She did not know what Fenmore would do. She did not know what it meant to be the daughter of a duke and a woman with open hands, what responsibilities it carried, what world it opened, what it asked of her. She did not know what it meant to be standing on a cold pavement in Salisbury, holding the hand of a man who had kept her secret and told her truth and watched her from a window before he knew who she was. She knew only that she was standing on solid ground, and that somewhere in Ashenveil Hall, in a corridor that no one was supposed to look at, a portrait of Isolde Vane hung with its hands open and its grey eyes forward, waiting, as it had always waited, to see what her daughter would do next. 3 days later, the message came. It arrived at Ashenveil before dawn, before the house had fully woken, slipped beneath the library door by a hand that had ridden through the night to deliver it. Pemberton Fife's seal. Isolde found it on her way to the kitchen, early as she always was, and she stood in the cold corridor with the paper in her hands and the lamplight not yet lit, and the hall breathing quietly around her. She did not open it immediately. She stood for a moment with the folded paper and the calm darkness and the sound of the house and the knowledge that whatever was inside it would divide her life cleanly into before and after, the way certain moments did, the way births and deaths and the closing of locks and the opening of hidden rooms did. Then she thought of her mother's open hands. She opened it, and the hall, old and watchful and full of buried things, held its breath and waited for the girl they had discarded to become everything they had buried.
That's the end, but it doesn't have to be goodbye. If you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. I promise it's worth the wait. And before you go, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story has traveled.